I had already wrapped his gift when the message came in. The paper was still warm from my hands, the tape not fully pressed down, and I remember thinking I would smooth it properly later after I made tea. The phone buzzed once on the table, not urgently, just enough to be noticed, and when I looked at the screen, I saw my son's name and felt that small, familiar lift in my chest that comes before hope has time to think. I opened it standing up. It said, "Don't expect us for Christmas. We're going to my wife's parents. They're important." There was no hello, no explanation, no smile at the end. I stood there longer than I should have, reading it again and again, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I thought maybe understanding would arrive later, the way pain sometimes does. The kettle clicked off behind me, sharp and final, and the kitchen went quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the clock above the sink I'd forgotten to wind properly, so it was already 5 minutes slow. I didn't sit down, I didn't answer, I just placed the phone face down beside the wrapped gift as if they were related, as if one might explain the other if I gave them enough time. The tree lights were on even though it was still afternoon because the days get darker earlier now, and I prefer not to notice when the light leaves. I had decorated the tree carefully this year, slower than before, testing each step, making sure I didn't lean too hard on my knee. I used the old ornaments, the ones that still smell faintly of dust and time, the ones my son used to hang too high and then pretend he couldn't reach again so I'd lift him. I hadn't planned to think about that, but the mind goes where it wants when it's not invited anywhere else. I told myself it was just a message, just a plan change, something young people do without weighing it, and that I would feel different once I made the tea. I poured the water anyway, even though it had already cooled, and watched it turn the bag brown, darker than I expected, like it was trying too hard. I carried the cup to the table and sat down at last, facing the empty chair across from me that I'd already pushed in, as if someone might come later and need it. I noticed then that my hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd imagined a shaking, a sharp intake of breath, some sign that what I'd read mattered, but my body behaved as if this were ordinary news, like a delivery delay or a change in weather. I thought of replying something neutral, something light, a sentence that wouldn't embarrass him or make him feel accused. I typed, erased, typed again, then locked the phone and slid it into my cardigan pocket. Silence felt safer than the wrong words. I looked around the kitchen and saw how prepared everything already was. The extra loaf of bread in the freezer, the small jar of his favorite jam that I only buy in December, the clean guest towels folded the way he used to tease me about, too neat, he'd say, like no one was allowed to touch them. I touched them now just to prove they were real. I told myself people don't owe each other holidays. I told myself he was married now, that things change, that parents are meant to step back quietly, like furniture that's been used long enough. But there was something about that sentence, that single word, important, that stayed with me. It wasn't that he chose them, it was that he explained it that way, as if importance were a ladder and I had simply ended up on a lower rung without being told when the climbing stopped. I wondered how long he'd known before he sent the message, if it had been discussed at a table I wasn't at, maybe over laughter, maybe casually, and whether my name came up at all, or only the idea of me, briefly, as something to notify. Outside, a neighbor's child was laughing, the sound sharp and bright, and I felt suddenly older than my years, like time had leaned forward without asking. I took a sip of tea and burned my tongue slightly, enough to remind me I was still there. I thought about Christmas morning as it would now be, the quiet stretching longer than planned, the food too much for one, the gift remaining unopened. I told myself I could adjust, that I always do, that this was not a disaster, just a small rearrangement. But as the afternoon light thinned and the tree lights became less decorative and more necessary, I realized something had already shifted, something unnamed but heavy, settling in the house the way cold does when you don't seal a window properly. And I knew, without knowing why yet, that this message was not about one day at all, and that whatever it was about had been happening for longer than I was ready to admit. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my body has learned to wake before it is needed, and the house felt different in the quiet, as if it had rearranged itself overnight. I lay still for a moment, listening, expecting the familiar creaks and settling sounds, but even those seemed cautious, like they were waiting for instructions. The phone was on the bedside table where I'd left it, screen dark, obediently silent. I didn't reach for it right away. I told myself there was no reason to. If he had wanted to say more, he would have said it already. Instead, I got up slowly, my feet finding the cold floor, and pulled the curtains just enough to see the sky, pale and undecided, the kind of morning that doesn't promise anything. In the bathroom mirror, my face looked unchanged, which felt almost insulting. I brushed my hair carefully, the way I always do, parting it just so because I have learned that keeping small routines intact can make larger absences less noticeable. In the kitchen, the wrapped gift was still on the table where I'd left it, neat and patient, and for a moment I considered moving it, putting it away somewhere less visible, but I didn't. I made breakfast as if it were an ordinary day, toast cut diagonally, 1 egg, coffee instead of tea, though it upsets my stomach if I drink it too fast. I ate standing up, looking out the window, watching a woman across the street scrape frost from her car, her movements brisk and purposeful, like she was late for something that mattered. I wondered if my son was awake too, if he'd already forgotten the message he sent, if it had already settled into his mind as a resolved task, done and filed away. I told myself not to imagine him laughing at another table, not yet, because that would be unfair, because I didn't know that to be true. After breakfast, I cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than necessary, wiping surfaces that were already clean, folding and refolding the dish towel, giving my hands something to do so my thoughts wouldn't wander too far. I remembered other Christmases without meaning to, not the big ones with guests and noise, but the quieter years when it was just the two of us after his father passed, when I learned how to make things feel full with less. He used to wake me early then, too excited to wait, and I'd pretend to be annoyed so he wouldn't see how much I liked it. Those memories arrived without pain at first, just observations, like old photographs discovered in a drawer you hadn't opened in a while. It was later, when I sat down with the mail and saw nothing addressed in his handwriting, that something tightened in my chest, subtle but persistent. I thought about replying then, finally sending something short and kind, something that would keep the door open without leaning on it. I typed, "Of course, enjoy your time," and stared at it long enough to notice how small it looked on the screen, how easily it could disappear. I deleted it. Silence, again, seemed safer. Around midday, I walked to the small grocery store at the corner, partly because I needed milk, partly because staying inside felt like giving in to something I didn't yet understand. The air was sharp, the kind that makes you breathe more carefully, and the sidewalks were already decorated with the first signs of holiday cheer, ribbons taped to lampposts, a plastic Santa leaning awkwardly against a bakery window. Inside the store, the cashier wished me a Merry Christmas without looking at me, her voice practiced and light, and I answered automatically, feeling like I'd borrowed someone else's words. I bought less than I'd planned, realizing halfway through that I no longer needed to think in plural portions. Back home, I put everything away and stood for a moment with the refrigerator door open, letting the cold spill out, then closed it gently as if not to disturb anything. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, and I filled it with small tasks, sorting old papers, watering plants that didn't need it, checking the calendar even though the dates were already familiar. Christmas was circled in red. I left it that way. As evening came, I noticed how easily the house accepted the dark, how the corners softened and the shadows grew longer without protest. I turned on the lamp by the sofa and sat down with a book I'd already read, turning pages without absorbing them, my thoughts drifting back to that word again, important. I wondered when that measure had been decided, who made the scale, and whether I had missed the moment my weight on it changed. I reminded myself that love isn't a competition, that families expand and rearrange, that there is room for many centers, but the reminder felt theoretical, like advice meant for someone else. I imagined Christmas morning again, the quiet, the gift still wrapped, and I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, not anger, not sadness exactly, but an awareness, sharp and unwelcome, that this was not an isolated moment, that it belonged to a longer pattern I had been carefully stepping around for years. And as the clock ticked steadily toward night, I realized I was standing at the edge of something I could no longer pretend was temporary. A week passed without another message, and in that time I learned how loud nothing can be. The days filled themselves the way they always do, with light coming and going, with meals that needed cooking and dishes that needed washing, but underneath it all there was a thin, constant awareness, like a sound just outside the range of hearing. I didn't check my phone as often as I wanted to. I told myself that was dignity. I told myself it was good practice for letting go. On the third day, I found an envelope mixed in with the usual mail, thicker than the rest, my son's handwriting on the front, careful but slightly rushed, the way it always is. I stood in the hallway holding it, coat still on, keys still in my hand, afraid that if I opened it too quickly, whatever hope it carried might escape before I was ready. I took it into the living room and sat down properly this time, placing the envelope on my lap, smoothing it once with my palm as if it were something alive. Inside was a wedding invitation. I hadn't known there would be one. The card was heavy, expensive, the kind of paper that doesn't bend easily, with both their names printed in neat lettering, centered and confident. The date was in the spring. The venue was somewhere I'd never been, a place with a long name and the word estate at the end of it. I read it carefully, then read it again, looking for a note tucked inside, a sentence written just for me, but there was nothing else. No explanation for the timing, no mention of the message from Christmas, just the invitation, formal and complete, like it had been sent to someone who already knew their place. I sat there for a long time, holding it, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Being invited felt like a correction, like proof that I hadn't been erased after all, only misfiled. I told myself this meant things were normal, that the Christmas message had been thoughtless, not intentional, that of course I mattered, why wouldn't I? I even laughed quietly at myself for how deeply I'd taken it, for building meaning where perhaps there was none. I placed the invitation on the mantel, straightening it until it looked balanced, and for the first time in days I allowed myself to imagine a future moment that included me. In the weeks that followed, there were a few brief exchanges, practical messages, times and dates, nothing warm but nothing sharp either. I responded politely, keeping my tone light, careful not to ask questions that might sound like accusations. I told myself this was how adults communicate now, efficiently, without unnecessary emotion. When I thought about the wedding, I focused on details that felt safe, what I would wear, how early I would need to arrive, whether the flowers would smell strong. I practiced smiling in the mirror, not a big smile, just enough. I wanted to look like someone who belonged there naturally. As the day approached, I noticed a quiet urgency in myself, a need to be precise, to do everything correctly, as if one wrong step might confirm a suspicion I was trying not to name. I bought a gift early and kept the receipt just in case. On the morning of the wedding, I woke before my alarm and lay still, listening to my heart, surprised by how steady it was. I dressed slowly, carefully pinning my hair, choosing the necklace his father once gave me, not because it meant anything to them, but because it anchored me. At the venue, everything looked exactly as the invitation promised: large, polished, busy with people who seemed to know where they were going. I arrived early as instructed and took my seat where an usher directed me without meeting my eyes. It wasn't the front, but it wasn't the back either, somewhere neutral. I told myself that was fine. As guests filled the rows, I noticed how few faces I recognized. His wife's family seemed to move easily through the space, greeting one another, laughing, touching arms, while I remained seated, hands folded, watching. When my son entered, standing tall beside her, I felt a familiar swell of pride, immediate and uninvited. He looked happy. That mattered. During the ceremony, I listened closely, absorbing every word, every promise, wanting to remember it properly, because this was important whether I was or not. At the reception, I stood when everyone else stood, clapped when they clapped, followed the flow without resistance. When it came time for the speeches, I waited, not expecting anything, but still listening carefully, alert. Her parents spoke, long, affectionate words, stories. Gratitude. His friends spoke. Laughter. Inside jokes. Then it moved on, seamlessly, without pause, without anyone looking in my direction. I felt it then, not as a shock, but as a quiet realization, settling gently but firmly. I sat back down when others remained standing, the applause washing over me like rain I hadn't stepped into. No one noticed. Later, when my son passed my table briefly, he smiled, quick and distracted, and said, "I'm glad you could make it," as if I'd been uncertain, as if my presence were optional. I smiled back and nodded, because that was what was expected, and as I watched him move away again, already absorbed elsewhere, I understood that the invitation had not been an apology or a bridge, but a formality, and that the distance I'd felt before Christmas had not closed at all, only learned how to present itself more politely. I stayed until the end because leaving early would have required explanation, and I no longer trusted myself to explain anything without revealing more than I was ready to admit. The music grew louder as the evening wore on, the kind of cheerful noise that fills space quickly and leaves no room for private thought. People moved easily around me, plates were cleared, glasses refilled, and I remained where I was, smiling when someone's eyes met mine, nodding when words were directed at me, though very few were. I noticed small things with unusual clarity, the way the light caught the edges of the tables, the faint ache in my lower back from sitting too straight, the sticky sweetness of the cake I ate even though I wasn't hungry. When the dancing began, I watched my son from a distance, the way I used to watch him at school events when he was younger, careful not to wave too enthusiastically, careful not to embarrass him. He never looked over. That didn't surprise me as much as I thought it would. By the time I finally stood to leave, the room was already thinning, coats being gathered, goodbyes exchanged. I found him near the door, surrounded, busy, and waited for a pause that never quite came. When I did speak his name, softly, he turned with that same distracted smile and said, "Oh, you're heading out?" as if it hadn't occurred to him that I might. I told him yes, that it had been a long day. He nodded and kissed my cheek quickly, his wife already tugging him back toward someone else. "We'll talk later," he said, without specifying when. I walked to my car alone, the cool night air settling around me like a blanket I hadn't asked for. On the drive home, the radio stayed off. I didn't trust myself with other voices. The house was exactly as I'd left it, quiet and patient. I changed out of my clothes carefully, hung them properly, placed the necklace back in its box. Everything had a place. That night I slept without dreaming, a heavy, blank sleep that felt earned. In the days that followed, there was a strange sense of relief mixed with something heavier. The wedding was over. The waiting, the imagining, the hoping for an unspoken correction had all ended. What remained was clearer, even if it wasn't kinder. I told myself this clarity was a gift. It allowed me to move forward without guessing. When my son called a week later, his voice sounded cheerful, light, as if nothing unusual had occurred. He thanked me for coming, mentioned how busy things had been, how they were still catching up. I listened, responded appropriately, kept my own voice steady. At one point he said, "I hope you weren't bored," and laughed, not unkindly, just unaware. I said, "Of course not." I said it had been lovely. There was a pause then, brief, and I wondered if he might say something else, something closer to the truth. But he didn't. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, noticing how easily the call slipped into memory, already fading, like a performance that had ended without applause. As spring turned into summer, contact became less frequent. Messages about logistics, holidays discussed vaguely and then left undecided. When Christmas came again, it arrived quietly, without ceremony. I didn't ask about plans, I already knew the answer. I spent the day alone, not dramatically, just as a fact. I cooked a smaller meal. I opened a book. I went to bed early. The house accepted it easily, as if this version of events fit better than the last. Still, there were moments when something sharp would surface unexpectedly. A comment from a neighbor about family gatherings, a photo online shared casually showing my son and his wife at another table, another holiday, another set of parents smiling proudly between them. I would look at those images longer than necessary, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity, trying to understand how something so gradual could feel so complete. I noticed then that my name rarely appeared in his stories anymore. When he spoke of the past, it was vague. When he spoke of the future, it was plural, but not inclusive. I was no longer an assumed presence. I was an addition, optional, easily omitted. That realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, the way dust does on furniture you no longer use. One afternoon, while sorting old documents, I came across a stack of photographs I hadn't looked at in years. Birthdays, school plays, ordinary moments, all captured carefully, labeled in my handwriting on the back. I sat on the floor with them spread around me, noticing how often I appeared only as the person behind the camera, how rarely anyone thought to turn it around. That didn't hurt at first. It had always been that way. What hurt was the understanding that this habit of stepping aside had not gone unnoticed or unlearned. It had become expected. I had taught them how little space I required. That evening, I stood in the living room and looked around, really looked, at the walls, the furniture, the objects accumulated over decades. Everything here told a story of accommodation, of making room, of staying quiet so others could feel comfortable. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have been easier. Instead, I felt something close to embarrassment, not for them, but for myself, for how carefully I had erased my own edges over the years, believing that love required it. I thought back to the message that started all of this, that single sentence so casually written, and understood now that it hadn't been a sudden decision or a cruel mistake. It had been honest. That was what unsettled me most. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I realized that something in me had shifted permanently, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that would not easily be reversed. And though I couldn't yet name what would come next, I knew with quiet certainty that I would not return to the way things had been. After that realization, life did not change in any visible way, and that was what made it difficult to explain, even to myself. I still woke early. I still shopped on the same days, walked the same routes, spoke to the same neighbors who nodded and asked polite questions without waiting for real answers. On the surface, everything remained intact, but inside something had become watchful. I noticed how often I had once filled silences first, how quickly I had smoothed discomfort before anyone else needed to feel it. Now I let pauses sit. When my son sent short messages, I answered just as briefly. When days passed without contact, I did not invent reasons for him. I told myself this was not punishment, it was accuracy. I began to observe rather than interpret. That shift felt subtle but steady, like adjusting one's footing on uneven ground. I stopped checking my phone before bed. I stopped imagining what might be happening in houses that were not mine. Instead, I paid attention to what was directly in front of me, the way the afternoon light fell across the dining table, the sound of my own breathing when the house was very still. I noticed how much energy I had once spent anticipating other people's needs and how quiet things became when I no longer did. There was relief in that quiet, though it came paired with a loneliness that felt more honest than before. One afternoon, my son called unexpectedly. I answered after the second ring, neither eager nor delayed. He spoke about practical things, about work, about plans that were still forming. He did not ask how I was. I did not volunteer the information. The call ended cleanly, without tension, without warmth. When I hung up, I sat for a moment longer than necessary, noticing that my chest did not feel tight. That surprised me. I had expected disappointment, maybe even grief. Instead, there was a neutrality that felt earned. In the weeks that followed, I sorted through things I had long ignored. Old files, receipts, documents tucked into drawers because they seemed too complicated to deal with at the time. I worked slowly, not with urgency, but with care. I made piles, labeled them, placed them where I could find them again. There was comfort in knowing exactly what I had and where it was. It made the house feel more solid, as if it were responding to my attention. Occasionally, I would pause, a paper in my hand, and think of my son as a child, how he used to ask endless questions, how he wanted explanations for everything. I wondered when that curiosity had turned outward, away from me, and whether I had encouraged it by being too easy to understand, too predictable. I didn't blame him. Blame would have required a confrontation I no longer wanted. Instead, I focused on endurance, on continuing without expectation of recognition. Friends called occasionally, distant acquaintances checking in. I answered kindly, declined invitations without excuse. I told them I was fine, and for once, it felt mostly true. There were moments, though, usually in the evening, when the weight of absence pressed more firmly. I would sit with it, not distracting myself, not reaching for something to soften it. I learned that it passed more quickly when I didn't argue with it. Winter came and went again. Another Christmas passed quietly. This time, I did not decorate early. I left the tree in its box until a week before, then put it up without ceremony. I wrapped no gifts. On the morning itself, I made coffee and watched the light change outside, feeling neither bitterness nor longing, just a calm acceptance that surprised me with its steadiness. Somewhere in that calm, I began to sense a boundary forming, not drawn sharply, but thickening slowly, like a wall built brick by brick without announcement. I did not inform my son of this boundary. I did not explain it to anyone. It existed only in the way I made decisions now, the way I no longer rearranged my life around possibilities that might never materialize. I became careful with my resources, my time, my attention. Not fearful, intentional. One day, while walking past the bank downtown, I stopped without knowing why. The building looked the same as it always had, solid and impersonal. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, feeling something stir. Not a plan exactly, but an awareness that there were parts of my life I had allowed to remain untouched out of habit, not necessity. I did not go in that day. I went home instead and made lunch, ate it slowly, then wrote a list of things I would address soon, when the time felt right. I folded the list and placed it in a drawer, not hidden, just waiting. That felt important, waiting by choice, not by default. When my son called again weeks later, his tone was lighter, almost cheerful. He mentioned being busy, mentioned travel, mentioned obligations. He asked if I was managing all right on my own. The question was casual, well-meaning, and for a moment I considered answering honestly, saying that I was more than managing, that I was changing. Instead, I said yes, I said I was fine, and I meant something different by it than he probably understood. After the call, I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, aware that whatever came next would not be accidental. I did not yet know its shape, only that it would come from this steadiness I had built, this silence I had learned to live inside, and that when it arrived, it would not need to announce itself to be real. By then, my days had developed a rhythm that felt intentional rather than inherited. I woke when my body told me to, not because there was someone waiting on the other end of the day. I ate when I was hungry. I rested when I was tired. These small permissions felt almost radical at first, as if I were breaking an unspoken rule about usefulness, but over time they became ordinary. I noticed how often I had once framed my choices around convenience for others, how rarely I had asked myself what I preferred. Now, preference became something I practiced, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. I chose the longer route on my walks because it passed the river. I sat on the bench there even when the air was cold, watching the water move steadily forward without hesitation. I liked the way it didn't look back. At home, I continued to sort through things, not in a rush, but with a growing sense of clarity. I gave away what I no longer used. I kept what mattered to me without justifying it. Each decision felt like a quiet statement, though no one was listening. My son's calls became predictable, spaced evenly, efficient. He spoke of responsibilities, of plans that required coordination, of a life that seemed very full. I listened without leaning in. When he mentioned holidays, I did not ask questions. I did not volunteer availability. He stopped offering explanations. This suited us both, I think. There was less friction when expectations were lowered. Sometimes after we spoke, I would sit with the memory of his voice and try to locate the ache that used to follow. It was still there, but muted, no longer demanding immediate attention. I learned how to carry it without rearranging my day around it. One afternoon, I met an old friend for tea, someone who had known me before I became careful with myself. She asked about my son, naturally, kindly. I answered simply. I did not soften the truth, but I did not dramatize it either. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You sound settled." I considered that word on the way home. Settled had once meant resigned to me, something you did when options ran out. Now it felt closer to grounded. As spring approached again, I returned to that list I had written months earlier. It was short. Address paperwork, review accounts, understand what is mine. The handwriting was steady. I read it without emotion, as if it belonged to someone else, then placed it on the table and began with the first item. I gathered documents methodically, stacking them neatly, checking dates, noting details I had previously skimmed past. There was no rush. This was not preparation for departure. It was maintenance. I made appointments when needed, canceled ones that felt unnecessary. When I walked past the bank again, I went in this time. The interior was quiet, cool, familiar in an impersonal way. I spoke to a young man who called me ma'am and listened carefully. I asked questions. I took notes. I did not explain my reasons. He did not ask. I left with a folder under my arm and the strange sense that I had just acknowledged something long overdue. At home, I placed the folder in the drawer with the list. The days after that settled into a quiet that felt heavier than before, not with grief, but with awareness. It was the kind of quiet that follows a truth spoken aloud, when there is nothing left to explain and nowhere left to hide. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, not expectation, and how often I put it back down without unlocking it. No messages came. None were promised. I did not mark the absence as a failure. I marked it as information. Friends noticed changes before I named them myself. One asked gently whether everything was all right between me and my son. I said yes, because nothing was wrong in the way people usually mean it. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no slammed doors. What existed instead was distance that had finally been acknowledged rather than disguised. That felt more honest than the closeness we had pretended before. I kept my routines intact. I went to the market, I paid my bills, I watered the plants. Ordinary acts grounded me, reminded me that life continues even when relationships rearrange themselves. Occasionally, a memory would surface unexpectedly, his hand in mine when he was small, the sound of his laughter in this very house, and I would let it pass through me without resistance. I did not rewrite those memories to fit the present. I let them remain what they were. One afternoon, my son's wife called again. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Her voice was controlled, careful, as if she were stepping across a floor she wasn't sure would hold. She said she hoped I was well. I said I was. She said there had been a lot of discussion lately, that things felt strained, that perhaps we could clear the air. I listened. I did not interrupt. When she finished, I told her I understood the desire for clarity. I told her there was nothing unclear from my side. I said my decisions were complete and not open to negotiation. I said this calmly, without emphasis. There was a pause. She asked if I was angry. I told her no. Anger implies expectation. I said I was simply realistic. She said family is supposed to support one another. I said support requires presence, not just entitlement. The words landed between us and stayed there. She thanked me for my time. We ended the call politely. Afterward, I sat by the window and watched a bird land briefly on the fence, then take off again. It struck me how little time it spent deciding. There was no bitterness in me, no desire to explain myself further. Explanation had been my lifelong reflex, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of not indulging it. My son did not call. Weeks passed, then months. The silence was not empty, it was full of adjustment. I noticed how much mental space had opened up when I stopped monitoring someone else's availability. I read more, I slept better. I planned small trips without checking anyone's calendar but my own. Still, there were moments when the consequences of my choice surfaced sharply. A holiday card from my son arrived, addressed formally, signed with both names, containing a generic message about the year ahead. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. I did not display it. On my birthday, a message arrived late in the evening, brief and correct. I thanked him, that was all. I did not ask about his life, he did not ask about mine. The space between us became defined not by hostility, but by boundaries neither of us crossed. I wondered sometimes whether he would eventually understand, not intellectually, but emotionally, what it shifted. I understood what he meant. I did not pretend otherwise. I told him that some things had been adjusted. My voice sounded steady to my own ears, factual. I did not offer details. He did not ask for them directly, but I could hear the shift in his breathing, the recalculation. He said he thought it might be good to talk about it together, maybe sit down soon and go over everything. I said that wasn't necessary. I said all the decisions had been made thoughtfully and legally, and that there was nothing urgent to discuss. Another pause followed, heavier this time. He asked, carefully, if this was because of something he'd done or not done. The phrasing struck me then not as defensive, but as unpracticed. I answered honestly. I told him it wasn't about punishment or reward. It was about accuracy. I told him I had realized my life and my care needed to reflect the reality of my relationships, not the version I had been hoping for. I said it calmly, without accusation. There was no benefit in raising my voice. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It wasn't angry, it was uncertain. He said he hadn't known I felt that way. I believed he meant it. That, too, was honest. I told him I didn't expect him to feel differently now. I only expected him to understand that I had adjusted accordingly. He asked what that meant exactly. I told him it meant I had ensured my affairs reflected my independence, that nothing would be assumed or automatic anymore. I said I wanted clarity for everyone involved. He mentioned family, obligation, tradition. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said tradition only works when everyone agrees to carry it, and that obligation without presence becomes paperwork. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. They felt true. He did not respond right away. When he did, he said he needed time to think. I told him that was fine. I told him I had taken my time as well. We ended the call politely. Afterward, I sat quietly, noticing the absence of the tremor I might once have expected. I felt tired, but not drained. Later that week, I met with a lawyer, someone recommended for their discretion. We reviewed everything carefully. I asked questions. I made adjustments where necessary. Nothing was done hastily. Nothing was done in secret. It was all documented, transparent, lawful. When I left the office, the air felt lighter, not because something had been taken away from anyone else, but because I had stopped carrying assumptions that no longer served me. Word traveled quickly, though no one told me directly. My son's wife called once, her tone polite but strained, asking if we could talk. I said we could, another time. I did not set a date. I did not feel obligated to manage her discomfort. A few days later, my son sent a longer message than usual. He wrote about misunderstanding, about being busy, about not realizing how things had seemed from my side. He wrote about families sticking together. I read it carefully. I did not respond right away. When I did, I thanked him for sharing his thoughts. I told him I believed he meant what he said. I told him my decisions were not a reaction to a single event, but the result of sustained observation. I told him I hoped he would build the life that felt right to him and that I was doing the same. There was no reply after that. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones. It was not neglect, it was consequence. I did not feel triumphant, I felt aligned. That night I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that arrives when something essential has been settled, not because it ended well, but because it ended truthfully. The days after that settled into a quiet that felt heavier than before, not with grief, but with awareness. It was the kind of quiet that follows a truth spoken aloud when there's nothing left to explain and nowhere left to hide. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, not expectation, and how often I put it back down without unlocking it. No messages came, none were promised. I did not mark the absence as a failure, I marked it as information. Friends noticed changes before I named them myself. One asked, gently, whether everything was all right between me and my son. I said yes, because nothing was wrong in the way people usually mean it. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no slammed doors. What existed instead was distance that had finally been acknowledged rather than disguised. That felt more honest than the closeness we had pretended before. I kept my routines intact. I went to the market, I paid my bills, I watered the plants. Ordinary acts grounded me, reminded me that life continues even when relationships rearrange themselves. Occasionally, a memory would surface unexpectedly, his hand in mine when he was small, the sound of his laughter in this very house, and I would let it pass through me without resistance. I did not rewrite those memories to fit the present. I let them remain what they were. One afternoon, my son's wife called again. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Her voice was controlled, careful, as if she were stepping across a floor she wasn't sure would hold. She said she hoped I was well. I said I was. She said there had been a lot of discussion lately, that things felt strained, that perhaps we could clear the air. I listened. I did not interrupt. When she finished, I told her I understood the desire for clarity. I told her there was nothing unclear from my side. I said my decisions were complete and not open to negotiation. I said this calmly, without emphasis. There was a pause. She asked if I was angry. I told her no. Anger implies expectation. I said I was simply realistic. She said family is supposed to support one another. I said support requires presence, not just entitlement. The words landed between us and stayed there. She thanked me for my time. We ended the call politely. Afterward, I sat by the window and watched a bird land briefly on the fence, then take off again. It struck me how little time it spent deciding. There was no bitterness in me, no desire to explain myself further. Explanation had been my lifelong reflex, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of not indulging it. My son did not call. Weeks passed, then months. The silence was not empty, it was full of adjustment. I noticed how much mental space had opened up when I stopped monitoring someone else's availability. I read more, I slept better. I planned small trips without checking anyone's calendar but my own. Still, there were moments when the consequences of my choice surfaced sharply. A holiday card from my son arrived, addressed formally, signed with both names, containing a generic message about the year ahead. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. I did not display it. On my birthday, a message arrived late in the evening, brief and correct. I thanked him. That was all. I did not ask about his life. He did not ask about mine. The space between us became defined not by hostility, but by boundaries neither of us crossed. I wondered sometimes whether he would eventually understand, not intellectually but emotionally, what had shifted. I wondered whether that understanding would matter by then. The house seemed to breathe more easily now, as if relieved of a tension it had carried for years. I moved furniture slightly, not for necessity but preference. I framed a photograph of myself from long ago, taken before motherhood reshaped my posture, and placed it where I would see it daily. It felt like reintroducing myself to someone I had known once and lost track of. There were nights when doubt visited quietly. I would lie awake and ask myself whether I had been too final, too firm, whether patience might have produced a different outcome. I did not dismiss these questions. I examined them carefully. Each time I returned to the same conclusion. Patience without reciprocity is not virtue. It is erasure. Knowing that did not make the choice painless, but it made it sustainable. One evening, I received a message from my son that was longer than the others. He wrote about missing the way things used to be. He wrote about feeling shut out. He wrote about not expecting things to change so drastically. I read it slowly, twice. I noticed what was present and what was not. There was no acknowledgement of specific moments, no recognition of patterns, only a general discomfort with consequence. I felt a familiar pull to soften, to reassure, to absorb his unease and offer relief. I let the feeling rise, then settle. When I responded, I thanked him for his honesty. I told him change often feels sudden to the person who wasn't paying attention. I told him I wasn't shutting him out. I was simply no longer arranging my life around absence. I told him the door remained open to connection, but not to assumption. I wished him well. I did not add anything else. There was no reply. The finality of that silence did not feel cruel. It felt earned. As autumn approached again, I found myself standing in the same kitchen where I had once wrapped his Christmas gift, the memories surfacing without pain. I realized then that the rupture I had felt that day had not destroyed something, it had revealed it, and though the path ahead was quieter than the one I had imagined years ago, it was clearer, shaped by choice rather than habit. I did not know what the long future would hold. I only knew that whatever came next would meet me whole, not waiting, not diminished, but standing firmly in the life I had finally claimed as my own. Time did what it always does when left alone. It moved forward without comment, smoothing sharp edges, not by erasing them, but by making them less demanding of attention. The silence between my son and me settled into something stable, no longer provisional. I stopped measuring it. I stopped wondering when it might break. It became part of the landscape of my life, like weather you learn to dress for rather than argue with. I woke each morning with a sense of orientation that had been missing for years. Not excitement, not dread, just clarity. I knew where I stood. I knew what belonged to me. That knowledge carried a quiet confidence I hadn't expected. I no longer felt the need to justify my choices, even to myself.
When people asked about family, I answered honestly but briefly. I said my son was well. I said we spoke occasionally. Both statements were true. I did not add longing to them. I did not subtract responsibility. They stood on their own. I filled my days with things that asked something back from me: a class at the community center, longer walks by the river as the seasons changed, conversations that unfolded slowly without an agenda. I noticed how much lighter my body felt when my attention was no longer stretched thin by anticipation. Even grief, when it came, arrived cleanly, without entanglement. I mourned what I had once believed motherhood would guarantee: the permanence, the unquestioned place. I did not mourn my son himself. He was still alive, still making his way. What I released was the idea that my worth was tethered to his acknowledgement. That release felt like stepping out of a room I hadn't realized was locked. The house changed as I changed. I repainted a wall a color I liked but had never chosen before. I rearranged shelves, giving prominence to objects that reflected my history beyond parenthood. Books I loved, photographs where I was centered, not incidental. I hosted small dinners, not holidays, just ordinary evenings, and noticed how comfortable I felt setting the tone, choosing the menu, ending the night when I was tired. There was no performance in it, just presence. On one of my birthdays, I woke to a message from my son sent early, thoughtful but restrained. I read it with appreciation, not hunger. I replied kindly. The exchange ended there. I did not wait for more. Later that day, I celebrated quietly, exactly as I wanted, and realized something important. The absence of reconciliation had not hardened me. It had freed me. I was no longer negotiating my self-respect against the hope of being chosen. I had chosen myself, calmly, without spectacle. Occasionally, I thought about how this story might look from the outside: a mother pulling away, a son confused by distance. People might assign blame, imagine cruelty where there was none. I understood that. Stories need villains to feel complete. But this was not that kind of story. No one had slammed a door. No one had been cut off. What ended was not love, but illusion. I had stopped mistaking tolerance for connection. I had stopped offering permanence where there was only convenience. That distinction changed everything. One afternoon, while sorting papers I no longer found intimidating, I came across the old Christmas card I had placed in the drawer months earlier. I held it briefly, then recycled it without ceremony. Not out of anger, out of irrelevance. It no longer represented anything unresolved. That felt like progress. As the years unfolded, I noticed a deepening steadiness in myself. Decisions came more easily. Regret visited less often. When it did, it was specific, manageable, not the vague ache that had once accompanied me everywhere. I did not fantasize about future conversations where everything would finally be said. I had already said what mattered, quietly, when it counted. There was no need to repeat it. I sometimes imagined my son explaining my absence to others, framing it in ways that made sense to him. I hoped he would be kind, but I no longer needed to be understood to be at peace. Understanding, I had learned, is not a prerequisite for dignity. On evenings when the house was especially still, I would sit with a cup of tea and reflect on the long arc of my life, the years of caretaking, the careful shrinking, the patience I had once worn like a badge. I did not condemn that version of myself. She did what she knew how to do. She loved deeply. She endured quietly. But she also disappeared slowly, believing that was the cost of love. I honored her now by refusing to disappear any further. There was a freedom in that refusal that felt earned rather than rebellious. I did not need revenge. I did not need apology. I needed alignment. And I had it. One winter morning, years after that first message, I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, gentle and unremarkable. Christmas approached again, but it no longer carried weight. It was just another season. I made coffee, stood at the counter, and noticed how full the house felt, even in its quiet. I thought briefly of the gift I had once wrapped and never given. The memory no longer stung. It felt like a marker, a turning point, the moment when I stopped waiting to be included and began living as if I already belonged, not to someone else's table, to my own life. That was the peace I carried forward, steady and sufficient, not loud enough to impress anyone, but strong enough to hold me.